I would like to read so that some might understand the universe better. I'm quoting from Discover magazine. Quote, 3 words that could overthrow physics. What is magnetism? The standard model still doesn't describe magnets' spooky action at a distance. By Bruno Maddox. Quote, when Pliny the Elder first beheld a magnet, he was utterly blown away. Quote, what phenomenon is more astonishing? Close quote, he wrote later. Quote, where has nature shown greater audacity? Close quote. In the 5th century, St. Augustine of Hippo agreed, declaring himself, quote, thunderstruck, close quote, by the sight of a magnet lifting several metal rings. Magnets, he announced, were proof that miracles were real and that God, therefore, existed. Quote, who would not be amazed, close quote, Augustine marveled. Quote, at this virtue of the stone, close quote. Certainly the 4-year-old Albert Einstein was amazed when his father showed him a compass. It was young Albert's first clue. He later wrote that there was, quote, something behind things, something deeply hidden, close quote, and he spent his life trying to find it. What was it that so impressed these men, these giants? It was that a magnet could move things without touching them. In science, that feat is known as, quote, action at a distance, close quote, and it was something that used to impress people. People would see a magnet move a piece of metal, or a moon trapped in an orbit around a planet, or a man in a restaurant levitate a salt shaker just by looking at it. And they would wonder, how was it possible? After all, as Isaac Newton pointed out in his Principia Mathematica, the notion that, quote, one body may act upon another at a distance through a vacuum without the mediation of anything else, by and through which their action and force may be conveyed from one to another, is to me so great an absurdity that I believe no man who has in philosophic matters a competent faculty of thinking could ever fall into it, close quote. Newton. Me neither. But it would appear that guys like Einstein, Newton, and myself, guys who see thing A controlling thing B at a distance and wonder about it, are all of a sudden rather thin on the ground. You see, at the end of last year, while vacationing with my family in an undisclosed rural location, I found myself reclining by a fireplace with a book entitled Electronics for Dummies by Gordon McComb and Earl Boyson. On page 10 of that volume, I read that electrons repelled each other without touching. In the same way, the 2 magnets will if you align them with their poles facing. At this point, realizing I must either have slept through or forgotten the high school physics class wherein it was explained how magnets manage that singular feat of interacting with each other at a distance, I set out on what I assumed would be a minutes-long odyssey to understand the phenomenon. 71 days later, I am still here with astonishing findings. For one thing, as far as I can tell, nobody knows how a magnet can move a piece of metal without touching it. And for another, more astonishingly still, perhaps nobody seems to care. This information was not easy to come by. My copy of Electronics for Dummies now shares a shelf with Mathematics of Classical and Quantum Physics by Frederick Byron Jr. and Robert Fuller. Should a doctor at any point take a cross-section of my brain, she will find patches of scarring and dead tissue, souvenirs of the time that I pursued the mystery of magnetism across the 11-dimensional badlands of string theory. Students of human pathos may one day cherish the 16-minute recording of me with my 100% positive feedback rating as an eBay purchaser, failing to make renowned physicist Steven Weinberg who won a Nobel Prize for unifying electromagnetism with a so-called weak force, admit that he can't explain how a magnet holds a dry cleaning ticket to the door of a refrigerator. It also troubled me for most of my life. But as far as I can tell, and that's personal for me, David Sanders, but as far as I can tell, and isn't that the point of science, that all of its bigger propositions come accompanied by this noble caveat? He really can't. When you get right down to it, the mystery of how magnets, how interacting with each other at a distance has been explained in terms of virtual photons, incredibly small and unapologetic imaginary particles interacting with each other at a distance. Thus, as far as I can tell, these virtual particles are composed entirely of math and exist solely to fill otherwise embarrassing gaps in physics, such as the interaction and repulsion between magnets. And as far as I can tell, because I've had it repeatedly and rather pityingly told to me, to want to pursue the matter any further is an impulse that marks its sufferer out as a man who doesn't know an awful lot about physics or science or the pursuit of truth in general. What I have learned, in other words, after 71 days of strenuous research, is that I and my fellow dummies no longer have a seat, if we ever did, at the dinner table of science. If we're going to find any satisfaction in this gloomy veil of misery and mystery, we're going to have to take matters in our own hands and start again, from first principles. On this day, this very hour, starting with the magnets holding my gym's yoga schedule to the creaking door of my filthy refrigerator, it begins.